Please welcome Skift Head of Research, Seth Borko.
Let's jump into it. You got the introduction about the research. That SNL skit is actually a great way to start this because there is this perception in the marketplace. We wanted to test it, and we did some survey work, and we found some really interesting results about whether consumers are tired of short-term rentals and some other key questions. So I've got 3 key questions that I want to answer for you today about where we're going as an industry. So let's just jump right into it. We'll start with that first question. Are travelers tired of short-term rentals? Remember the good old days back in 2009 where you can book a room in Paris for $20 on Airbnb? With the Olympics going on, I don't think you're going to get a $20 room rate anymore. Well, like that SNL skit implied, and like if you just go on Twitter, you'll see, times have changed. There's a lot less satisfaction with the Airbnb product today. And if you'll excuse the memes, a little bit of fun, I wanted to ask the question, really, is this sentiment from SNL and from Twitter, is this just online cranks? Are these a minority, or does it represent a real sea change and a shift in consumer behavior and consumer preferences? So we commissioned this study, and I'm glad to tell you that for the most part, we think that it's a myth, that consumers are not really that tired with the short-term rental market. What we did when we looked at the study, we were surprised. We actually found that vacation rentals, in general, had higher net promoter scores, which is a really strong measure of consumer satisfaction, had stronger net promoter scores than their peers in the hotel market. And so I want to thank my colleague Sonia Zanpour, who led this research. You can use this QR code here again to download it. So we found pretty high satisfaction with short-term rentals. In fact, in our survey work, when we asked people who had stayed in a short-term rental within the last year, would you book again in another short-term rental? We found very high likeliness, likely or very likeliness, to book again in another short-term rental within the next 12 months. That's a very strong sign of satisfaction. So case closed, all's good, right? I would still say no. Not everything is warm and fuzzy in short-term rental land. And all of those complaints that were on Twitter, that you saw on the SNL, those measure very, very highly when we ask people, what didn't go right with your vacation rental? What might stop you from booking one? Things like junk fees, and I would 100% consider some of the cleaning fees that are charged on these platforms to be junk fees. Price and inconsistencies, where those extra booking fees, cleaning fees, the price that you pay doesn't add up to the price that you thought you were going to pay. And of course, extreme rules, laundry lists, demands by host, things like that. People get hit on average with a $75 clean fee when they book a short-term rental stay. And remember that net promoter score, that customer satisfaction I was telling you about? Well, here's the thing. It's highly dependent on the fees that are charged by the host. We did a little correlation. We did a little crosstab, and you can see the correlation. That leftmost bar, I think this is off by just a little bit. But what you can see is that basically when cleaning fees paid are 10% or less of the overall price of the stay, the net promoter score is dramatically higher. And there's a very strong direct correlation between how much you charge in fees and how satisfied guests are where they're stayed. And so when we say that promoter scores are higher for the short-term rental sector than the hotel sector, it's really only for those where there's less junk fees, more transparency, more consistency. So it's important that we clean up our act. I don't want to be too negative. I do want to reemphasize what makes for a really great, wow, short-term rental experience. That's something that we also asked about. Number one, right out of the gate, is, of course, pricing. People really do care about the price for their stay. And while short-term rentals may not be overall cheaper, they are generally better value overall, and that's an important thing to guests. Also really important is the destination, the location, as well as the amenities. The kitchens, the bedrooms, the hot tubs, all of those nice things. And then, certainly lower on this list, but not last by any means, is the uniqueness of the accommodation, personalization, interactions with those hosts. Those are the pieces that make a short-term rental stay very experiential, and that's a really important thing to guests. The experiential economy is growing, and we want to tap into those trends in the marketplace. Let's move on to the second big question. How do consumers find and book stays? This will be no surprise to many in this room. The overwhelming majority of guests book short-term rental stays through indirect third-party channels. And here in the US, the big 3 third-party channels are, of course, Airbnb, Vrbo and the Expedia group, and Book and Holdings. So we did some survey work. This, I want to emphasize, is not quite market share. This doesn't account for length of stay, nor does it account for the total price paid for a stay, but it is indicative of kind of broad consumer usage of these platforms. We asked, which platforms did you use last year in 2023? And how do you recall which platforms you recall using over the last 5 years? And you can see a big upswing for Airbnb in the most recent year. I think that's partially because Airbnb is doing well. I don't know if it's entirely to Airbnb's credit, though. I think a big part of it is the rebound in urban and international cross-border travel, where Airbnb has a lot more inventory in those kind of markets. And so as we've seen international travel come back and urban travel come back, Airbnb has grown. I want to touch a bit on the urban short-term rental market, because it is important. We often think about short-term rentals as these beautiful 8-bedroom villas and these scenic lakeside destinations. But the urban market is important. And again, according to our survey work, some of the top vacation rental stay destinations are in large cities. And data from one of our partners, Lighthouse, suggests that inventory growth has grown very fast in urban markets. We're going to also have AirDNA on here later today. He'll talk a little bit about this. So we are seeing growth in the urban markets that's benefiting Airbnb. One of the things that's also interesting about urban market growth is that I think it really encourages blurring the lines between hotels and short-term rentals. This is a trend that we talk about all the time. We've talked about for many years. You know, I recently stayed at an Airbnb. I went to Blue Ridge, Georgia. It's a beautiful, beautiful location in northern Georgia. I got this great 8-bedroom Airbnb. Loved it. There's no hotels in Blue Ridge, Georgia, or very, very few hotels. I have to book a short-term rental. But when I flew in and I stopped in Atlanta, well, guess what? There was a lot of hotels to book from. And so when you're in urban markets, the competition is not one short-term rental versus another short-term rental. The competition is short-term rental versus hotels. That's a very different matchup. Now, there are some platforms like Booking.com, who we're going to have on stage later today, and they display, many more are doing this, they display vacation rental results alongside hotel results. That blurs the line even further. That's a great thing for us because we can kind of steal some of those hotel customers, but it also presents some challenges because you get guests who have more hotel-like expectations. One of the really important hotel expectations has to do with loyalty. And in our survey, we found that more than half of all short-term rental guests also held a loyalty membership with another hotel group. So you have that competition. Also, many held loyalty with airline groups as well. So you have an increase in expectation to earn rewards from your stays. In fact, again, we asked about this directly. Would you be more likely to use short-term rentals more frequently if you could earn loyalty points? The answer was an overwhelming yes. People really want to see loyalty come in. We're going to have Jennifer on stage from Marriott later today. Obviously, loyalty is a big part of the Marriott Homes and Villas strategy. And interestingly, since we're talking about third-party platforms, you can earn loyalty points on both Booking.com and Expedia when you book short-term rental stays. So you can earn 1 key cash for booking a short-term rental stay on Vrbo. You can earn points towards not points, but qualifications toward the Genius program on Booking.com. So that leaves kind of Airbnb as the odd person out. It's kind of interesting. I wonder if this will finally force Airbnb's hand in terms of creating a loyalty program. This was from an interview that our editor-in-chief, Sarah, did with Brian Chesky, where he said, you know, hey, maybe a loyalty program is in the works. He hates points programs. I actually tend to agree with him. We can chat about that, off stage if that's something you're interested in. So let's definitely watch this space as competition intensifies. Maybe some announcements to come from Airbnb. Okay, the final big question I have for this industry is, what happened to the promise of those branded professional property managers? This is our third in-person short-term rental conference, and almost exactly 1 year ago today, I was on stage doing a very similar presentation, and I had this slide, and I said the promise of professionalization remains unfulfilled. Saunders not profitable, Vacasa's not profitable, we don't have market leaders in some very key spaces. What's going to happen? Well, it's been 1 year. What happened in 1 year? What happened in 1 year? The three largest branded, publicly traded companies in the space, they've lost $250 million in market cap between the three of them. So I would say the promise is still somewhat unfulfilled. It raises an interesting question. This is only three companies, of course. So it raises an interesting question, which is it the fault of these three companies? Are they having an issue with their capital structure or their operations? Or is it just that guests don't really care about branded stays or about professional short-term rental stays? Do they even know the difference? Is this something that consumers want? Well, we asked about this as well. Do guests even care? Our answer, yes, they do. One of the first things we asked about is awareness. Do guests even realize when they're booking with a professional host versus an individual host? Our work suggests that 3/4 of guests do check whether a home is professionally managed or not. This is something that they know and they care about. People have preferences. Not everyone prefers professionally managed homes, but those that do, the reasons that they give are things like better service quality, trustworthiness, that consistency and standardization, as well as, of course, cleanliness and hygiene standards. So I don't think that this is a market that's broken. Maybe it's one that still needs to be, better tapped. Again, how likely would you be to stay in a short-term rental if they had more standardized rooms like hotels? We see that guests are telling us that this is something that they would like to see more of. All right, so I guess individual hosting is dead. There's no market for it. It's all going professional. Also, still no for that, right? Airbnb is betting pretty strongly on individual hosts, and like we saw, they're seeing a lot of growth, right? This is a story that Dennis did. Airbnb thinks its edge over Vrbo and Booking is its individual host. I think one of the really important nuances to understand about individual hosting is whether you actually know or meet the host. So when you have an individual host and the guest gets the chance to meet the host, again, back to these Net Promoter Scores, these satisfaction scores, when they meet the host, huge boost to Net Promoter Scores. When they don't meet the host, dramatically lower satisfaction on the individual side. So I think it's very much, look at the top reasons why travelers like individually managed home. I think it's very much about that personalization, that experiential travel that the individual hosts can bring to it. And when individual hosts do that right, it is an amazing experience with high, very high guest satisfaction. When I think about individual hosts versus professional hosts, I can't help but think back to this really old ad that used to run, right? Are you a Mac or are you a PC? And I kind of think of those professional branded hosts as a bit of the PCs sometimes. They're standardized, they're reliable, they're consistent, you know what you're going to get. And I can't help but think of the individual host as a little more of that Mac product, right? They're unique, quirky, creative, a little bit different, but a lot more maybe fun in some cases. It's interesting that in the real world, of course, PCs have a lot more market share. More people use PCs because they're more reliable and consistent. And of course, in our industry, if you have consistency, you can have a lot greater depth of inventory in any given market than, say, a more individual host, which is a lot harder to bring those hosts online and create a consistent product at scale. So it's sort of a decision between, which path do you want to go. I think it's important to remember that is one right or is one wrong? I would say no. It's a little bit of both. It's really important to remember that there's not one single market for short-term rentals. There are many different short-term rental use cases, many different types of guests. Sometimes you're traveling with a family. You want a large, big, consistent, reliable home. Sometimes you're traveling as a couple or solo. You're going to an urban location. You want to meet a host. You want to have a different experience. It's really important to keep in mind the guest, the use case, the type of trip. And that's how you can kind of determine which one succeeds. I don't think that there's a right answer, professional or individual. I think it's kind of important to decide which one you want to be, though, and be able to articulate that experience to the guest. So we're coming to the end of this talk. I want to just recap the key questions that I wanted to ask to kind of help understand the future of this industry. So one, are travelers tired of short-term rentals? Our answer, not yet, but frustration with junk fees and inconsistent services is growing. It's a really important elephant in the room that we need to address as an industry. Distribution, how do consumers find and book stays? Primarily through third-party platforms, although competition among those platforms is heating up. And then, is that promise of professional branded property managers dead? Our answer is no. Consumers do care about staying with professional managers, but there also remains a place for individual hosts. And then there are many, many more questions that we can ask, and in fact, we will ask on stage here throughout the rest of the day. Questions around geographies, what's happening outside the US, about personas, consumer demand, about hosting, about supply, about regulation, about technology. We're going to ask all those questions on stage here today, and I'm looking forward to hearing the answers about the future of our industry. And so with that, I'm going to wrap up. Again, one more plug for our research report that this presentation was based on. If you're interested in reading the report, you can scan that QR code and dive deeper into the report than I went today. Thank you so much for giving me the time. Look forward to spending the day with you here. Enjoy.